Hi, friends, and welcome. On today's adventure, we're headed for the Slate Hills of east central Kansas, and by we, I mean the Tin Man, my good friend Mr. Tom Dewey, and I. And together, we're going down to Fredonia, Kansas to see our old friend Mr. Ed Barton of B&C Kansas Hunts. Now, we try to get down there every year, and this year was going to be no exception. And I should tell you, if you're a frequent flyer, well, then you know this year's hunting trips have been, well, let's just say a little off, a little strange for me. So I was certainly hoping to see some more normal hunt situations when I got there. Either way, I always look forward to going down and hunting with Ed. Only had 4 days, but to tell you the truth, we saw so much action I can't possibly show you more than 2 of them. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed for the Sunflower State looking for a big-time buck right now. We heard a bunch of coyotes that morning and then saw one come sneaking in near our stand. But unfortunately, that's all we saw that first morning. We had a pack of coyotes work through that first morning, not deer. Still, even though the wind was starting to really gin up, we saw some deer starting to move about 4 o'clock. I had hopes the afternoon was going to be a little better. Early that afternoon, we did see a few small deer moving around, but it wasn't till later when the bigger deer got on their feet. And it was almost dark before we saw any bucks on the move. There was an adult doe running around in a what can be described as strange manner, and then I saw him. A good-sized buck was working his way up the hill, pushing her around. He had a real different, over-the-top, overlapping rack. He also went over the hill, and I never did see that buck again. A half hour after daylight the next morning, we were watching deer working their way in from the field below us. I could see a doe and a fawn, and they were slowly working their way up the hillside toward our feed station. They'd come all the way up the hill, but they were acting mighty nervous. In fact, they didn't even go over and try to eat any corn. They just slowly circled us. The doe stopped and sniffed my scent station, and then they hopped the fence and just kept on going. I watched as that doe kept pushing off her fawn and then trotting back and forth in opposite directions. And then I saw why. A 2-year-old buck with a busted-off main beam was dogging their trail and following them up out of the valley. Unfortunately, this wasn't a shooter. At least not yet. That 2-year-old buck with the busted-off main beam certainly wasn't what I'd driven all the way to Kansas hoping for, but I do recall wondering, I wonder just what broke that off. That afternoon, we did see another buck, A dandy buck. He was chasing a doe around the hillside off to the right of our stand about 35-40 yards. Unfortunately, he kept chasing her off to the right of our stand. We watched him make a couple of circles on the side of that hill, but they never did come in close enough for a shot.
The rut giveth and the rut taketh. Some nice bucks running around your head was right. Chasing does like that. At least the wind is only terrible. And it's cold.
That appeared to be a 3-year-old, 9 or 10 point. I wasn't real sure. He certainly wasn't the biggest buck down at Ed's, but it was obvious the rut was still swinging, and yes, for the record, he was big enough to interest me. The next morning was a lot clearer and a lot quieter, and even with my tired old ears, I kept thinking I was hearing something walking through the leaves around the base of the hill. I've been doing this a long time, and I know the difference between the hop of a squirrel, the shuffle of an armadillo or a possum, and the steady crunch of a hard-hoofed animal cutting leaves. And this was definitely a deer. I just couldn't see it. And then a little needlehead buck slowly peeked his way out and made his way across. He was just kind of sneaking along, hoping maybe there'd be a leftover girl or something, I don't know. But after he passed, we sat for quite a while without seeing much of anything. And then, maybe an hour later, just as the wind started to pick up, I noticed so was the deer movement. First, it was a couple of does working off the edge of the hill, and then a few minutes later, another one out in the field. They were starting to walk in circles, actually. I kept watching, and then I realized they were watching something too. Only it wasn't me. I decided to try a few grunts, and I noticed a doe sneaking up out of the bottom, and then jackpot. A monster of an 8-point was crossing right behind my stand. He was trailing a doe about 20 yards back, and if he kept following her, he was going to work himself right into our wheelhouse. This buck had the body of a true titan, and he was being just as cautious as a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old buck ought to be. But if he kept coming, all I needed now was just a step. Not that way. A step into my shooting lane. He eased up the hill and I finally got the bow to full draw. And then I noticed the look on Tom's face, his eyes. He couldn't see the deer. I had to let down. Tom just couldn't bend the camera arm any farther. I tried grunting him back, but he just kept walking right off the point of the hill.
Close, buddy. That's beautiful. Gorgeous deer.
That was one of the very best 8 points I have ever seen in the wild. His G2s had to be 13, 14 inches long, and he was absolutely massive. I figured him 4 or maybe even 5 years old. And for the record, no, I didn't yell at Tom. That's just the way it goes when you do this for a living. If you want to be me, sometimes you just have to pass until a critter gets on camera. With darkness closing in, I'll admit I was sitting there playing the what-if game in my mind, sort of licking my wounds, when I looked out in the field and there was another big buck working in toward our hill. There was another huge-bodied buck pushing some does up the creek bank behind us. When he got in a little closer, I could see he had 4 or 5 normal points on his right side and some kind of big old fork and horn thing on the left. He had massive bases, but I have to tell you, friends, it wouldn't have mattered. The size of his body was so impressive, I wouldn't have cared if he was a spike. He had worked to within about 30 yards, and then he just stood there for a few seconds. I needed him to help me a little bit. I needed him to get into one of my shooting lanes. And then he started up the hill the same way the big 8-point had gone, only this time we'd already moved the camera rig. We were ready. I grunted him to a stop, and he pulled up a step short. He just stood there, turning, looking around, and then I saw the drop tine coming down the back of his head. I could see the true mass of him. This was a monster buck. And now, all I needed was just a step forward, and he turned right. He walked right past the edge of my shooting lane. He was actually coming closer, though. Everybody just needed to hold their breath. Sooner or later, I was going to get my chance. And then the buck turned and faced back downhill. Now I just needed a step. Just past that dead tree, I had a good shooting lane. He started to move, and then he turned around again. It was like he couldn't make up his mind. He went up the hill, and then he came right back down, only this time he kept right on going. He actually walked away from that doe and 2 fawns. I couldn't believe it. By the time my nervous system got over that trauma, it was getting cold, it was getting late. But it wasn't over, not yet. There was another big buck, a big 6-point, looked like a 3-year-old working his way down the hill. I couldn't believe it. Another great buck. He just stood there, looking. He'd take a couple of steps and stand. I didn't know what his deal was, but he wasn't in any hurry. What I did know was if he came down here a little farther, He was definitely going to be in some peril. For 5 full minutes, he didn't move more than a couple of feet in any one direction. He'd stared downhill, and then across the hill, and then up the hill. And then finally, another buck came. This buck wasn't as old, but he was decent looking. I couldn't tell was he a shooter, but there was definitely something. There must be a doe up there somewhere that was holding these guys' attention. Unfortunately, it was holding it too far up on the hill, and it was getting dark.
I don't know if it's a shooter or not. It might be small.
And then it was just too dark. 2 great bucks, and I didn't get a shot at either one of them. That drop tine buck was massive, and he came along at the right time. We'd made the necessary camera adjustments to get on my shooting lane over there, only, he never walked into it, at least not long enough for me to take a shot. And that great big 6-point, he stood out there forever, but he never came down that hill until it was too late to take a run at him. I couldn't believe it. We were seeing all kind of bucks, but friends, I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I was starting to get that weird hunt feeling all over again. By the cold, clear light of the next morning, our last in Kansas, I was watching a doe, but my mind was way back in Michigan. We were 15 hours and 5 states from Thanksgiving dinner, and this time tomorrow, I needed to be there. And then, just as the sun cleared the treetops, my attention was jerked back to reality. There was a doe coming up the creek bank, and she had an old friend coming along for the walk. Mostly because the wind was forecast to build to over 20 miles an hour again today, I'd brought along the crossbow this time instead of my regular bow. And I was thinking, if he gets up where he was the other day, he was doing slow laps down in the creek bed trying to ride herd on a couple of does he now had in front of him. He kept staring and working his way toward us and then back. And then I realized there was another small buck, a young 8-point, standing right behind us. The big boy went over, started working his scrape. And then he decided he'd had enough. It was time for that youngster to leave. He started pushing him off, and if he kept following that other buck, but he didn't, he turned off to the right. And then I heard it. Another buck had come down the hill behind us, and this was definitely a shooter.
Did you see that? That buck. I even ranged that. It's exactly 30 yards. He's just walking. He's standing right over there. That's amazing. Folks, if you don't believe a buck can duck a crossbow exactly 30 yards, right on, and he was dumped underneath that thing. Oh, yeah. I thought we had her right there, buddy. Nice 9-point. We had another nice buck chasing around behind us, too small. There's deer running all over Ed's place here. Man, I can't believe it. Wow. I was already putting that one in the truck. There you go. He ain't spooked. He's walked. Well, you can quit laughing. It ain't funny. Much. Man. What do you say?
That, my friends, is what I call getting a little Western. A really good deer, what should have been a good shot, and all I got was leaves. Poor Tom almost fell out of the tree laughing. Still, it was a great hunt. We saw so many tremendous deer, we couldn't even show them all to you in a half-hour program. And I want to say, for myself at least, that will forever answer the question, can a buck duck a crossbow? Answer, obviously. It's not a rifle that shoots arrows. It's a piece of archery equipment, and it's a lot of fun to use. We've taken a lot of really good critters with that one. That's no cheap old slow bow. That's a first-rate piece of equipment. The fact is, though, sometimes the deer wins, and this year, well, let's just say it continues to be the strangest one I can remember. Hey, we want to thank Mr. Ed Barton from BNC Kansas Hunts again. Ed, we enjoy coming down there so much. You have such great critters, and we're truly looking forward to seeing you up at the expo this year. Friends, I hope I see some of you out there. I hope your season's going a little more normal than mine is, and hit 'em or missing, strange story or great picks. I hope I get to see you at the expo, and if I don't see you over there, well, hopefully I'll see you right back here, so we can share that cup and a fire and another adventure from my Wilderness Journal.